The letter came on a Tuesday. Harlow read it twice, set it on the kitchen table, and went outside to split wood for an hour. When she came back in, it was still there. Her daughter was watching from the doorway. She didn't ask. She'd learned not to. The letter was from the Department of the Army. It was polite. It used phrases like "in recognition of" and "distinguished service" and "with deepest gratitude." What it didn't say, anywhere in its 3 careful paragraphs, was that they'd gotten it wrong, that they'd had it wrong for 6 years, that the woman who'd been passed over, written up, reassigned, and quietly sidelined had in fact been right about everything that mattered. But Harlow knew, and so did the man who'd signed the letter. She'd met Brigadier General Mace once, briefly in a hallway at Fort Bragg 7 years before any of this. He'd looked through her the way senior officers sometimes look through female staff sergeants, not with contempt exactly, just with the particular blindness of a man who has already decided what he's looking at. She'd stood straight, said "sir," and stepped aside. That was the job. You learn to carry the invisibility like a piece of kit, heavy at first, then just part of the load. Her name was Harlow. First name Erin, though almost nobody called her that. In the 75th Ranger Regiment, you were your last name or you were nothing. And Harlow had been content with that arrangement from the first week of RASP, when she'd figured out that the fastest way to get through something brutal was to stop thinking of yourself as a person with a history and start thinking of yourself as a problem that needed solving. She was good at solving problems. She'd grown up in Billings, Montana. Father was a diesel mechanic. Mother had died when Harlow was 11, ovarian cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to funeral. Her father didn't talk about it. He just kept working. She understood that later, when she had her own way of not talking about things. She enlisted at 19. By 23, she'd completed Ranger School. The first time through, no recycling, 41 days. She was the 3rd woman in the school's history to earn the tab without repeating a phase, and the evaluation report her primary instructor wrote was so carefully worded, demonstrates tactical proficiency, commensurate with course standards, physical performance consistent with Ranger requirements, that you could read it 5 times without noticing it was actually remarkable. That was intentional. She understood that too. What the evaluation didn't capture was the night on Darby Queen, when she'd been running on 4 hours of sleep across 3 days, carrying 62 pounds on a frame that weighed 143, and she'd still been the one who noticed the simulated IED placement that the rest of her patrol had walked right past. Her lane grader had said nothing in the moment. He'd just made a note. She found out about the note 3 years later from a master sergeant named Tillman who'd been there that night and who'd run into her at a range in Georgia. He told her over lukewarm coffee that her lane grader had talked about that patrol for months afterward. "Best threat identification I saw all cycle," he'd apparently said. "Just nobody's going to make a career out of saying it." Harlow had nodded, finished her coffee, and gone back to zeroing her rifle. The assignment to 2nd Battalion came in the fall. She was a staff sergeant by then, leading a team in Charlie Company. The welcome was what it was. Some of it was professional distance, the careful way experienced soldiers hold newcomers at arm's length until they've seen what they can do. Some of it was something else. The first week she'd walked into the team room, and the conversation had stopped, not dramatically, not with hostility, just that particular quiet that meant you are the subject of something that was just said, and everyone had made the calculation to let it hang there. She'd set down her kit, checked the rack situation, and asked Staff Sergeant Odom, who had the best maintenance record in the company, which she'd looked up before arriving, whether the cleaning station was open. He'd blinked, said yes. She'd said thank you, and gotten to work. That was Harlow's approach. Not proving anything, just working. The ones who needed to be loud about doubting her, she left alone. The ones who were just watching, those she understood. She'd been watching people her whole life too. By the end of the 2nd month, Odom had started leaving maintenance notes on her rack when he found things she might want to know. Small things. Which armorer was fastest? Which range slots were least contested on Thursday mornings? It wasn't friendship exactly. It was the beginning of something that might become trust, and Harlow knew better than to rush it. Her team leader was a warrant officer named Goss. He was competent, controlled, and had a way of issuing corrections that made you feel like a problem he was solving rather than a person he was talking to. He never treated her differently than he treated anyone else. She gave him credit for that. What he couldn't seem to do was look at her during briefings. He addressed the space to her left. She noticed. She didn't say anything. The platoon sergeant, Master Sergeant Dean, was different. He was from South Carolina, had 21 years in, and spoke slowly enough that newer soldiers sometimes mistook it for simplicity. It wasn't. He'd processed the situation in the first week and made his conclusion. He started including her in after-action conversations that he could have reasonably excluded her from. He asked her questions about breach sequencing, and she answered them. He didn't praise the answers. He just nodded and moved on, the way you do when someone confirms something you already suspected. She appreciated that more than she would have appreciated compliments. The deployment orders came in March. Eastern Afghanistan, Kunar Province, a stretch of valley terrain that the battalion had rotated through twice before, and that everyone agreed was unpleasant in exactly the ways that matter. Altitude, limited exfil options, and indigenous force presence that was reliable on the maps and variable in practice. The mission set was direct action and reconnaissance. Specific targets were compartmented until they needed to be known. The first 3 weeks were fine, methodical. She ran point on 2 patrols and anchor on 4 others. The work was the work. Move at night, hold at dawn, observe, report, return. Her long-range marksmanship had been a matter of record before the deployment. 98th percentile on the qualification tables, a performance at the Special Operations Target Interdiction course that one of the evaluators had described in writing as technically exceptional, but the record was separate from what the team knew about her personally. Records were paper. She was a person they were still calculating. The moment that changed the calculation came on a reconnaissance mission to a ridge system northeast of the Afab. The team was 8 hours into a movement that had started feeling wrong around hour 5. Not wrong with information. There was no specific indicator, no confirmed threat, just wrong with the particular atmospheric quality that experienced soldiers learn to wait before they can explain it. Harlow had been running it through in her head since the 3rd waypoint. Something about the pattern of activity in the valley below. Too quiet in the wrong places. Movement in the wrong sectors. She brought it to Goss during a rest halt. She laid it out the way she always laid things out. No drama, specific and sequential. Here is what I observed. Here is what it might mean. Here is what I'd suggest we consider. He listened. He said he'd take it under advisement. He kept the patrol on course. 40 minutes later, the lead element walked into an observation post. Insurgent, 2 personnel. Harlow dropped the first one at 312 meters before the second could key his radio. Goss's fire was 11 seconds behind hers. They secured the position, called it in, exfilled under contingency. Nobody said anything on the ride back. The debriefing was precise and professional. What happened was documented in the way that things get documented when they go right, but could have gone worse, which is to say, accurately and without flourish. Dean found her afterward. He didn't say nice shot or good work or anything that would have landed wrong. What he said was, walk me through what you saw at the 3rd waypoint. And she did. And when she finished, he looked at her for a moment and said, yeah, that's what I thought you saw. Then he left. It wasn't validation exactly, but it was something she could build on. The operation that changed everything was designated Falcon Bridge. She wasn't supposed to be on it. The original package called for a 6-man element. Her team was slotted for overwatch on a separate task. 3 days before the mission, one of the Falcon Bridge operators had a medical issue. Nothing dramatic. A ligament problem that had been managed for weeks and that finally presented itself with the kind of timing that combat scheduling specializes in. The replacement slot went to her. She heard about the reassignment from Odom, who'd heard it from the operations sergeant, who'd heard it from Dean. The chain was telling in the way informal chains always are. It meant the decision had not been universally celebrated. She showed up to the planning cell at 0430 as directed. The team leader for Falcon Bridge was a captain named Rel, a ranger officer with 2 prior deployments and the particular confidence of a person who has been good at things for long enough to stop questioning whether he might occasionally be wrong. He looked at her when she came through the door and then looked at the team sergeant, a senior sergeant named Blaine, with exactly the kind of look she'd been reading for 6 years. The look said, this is the replacement. The look also said, I have thoughts about this. Blaine's look said nothing at all. He handed her a mission packet and told her to get read in. The target was a facilitator network operating out of a village compound system approximately 14 kilometers from the FAB. Intelligence suggested 3 to 5 high-value individuals in residence, with irregular security of 12 to 20 personnel. The timeline was compressed. A surveillance window had opened and was expected to close within 48 hours. Speed was a premium. She read the packet twice. Then she read the terrain analysis. Then she read the surveillance photos again. She went to Blaine. She told him the approach route on the packet used a drainage feature that would put them in a channelized position for approximately 400 meters. She pointed to the photo. She noted that the western ridgeline offered an elevated approach that added 11 minutes to the movement, but kept the element above the channelization until 50 meters from the outer wall. She said she understood the timeline pressure. She said she thought the 11 minutes were worth considering. Blaine looked at the photo for a long time. Then he said, "You squared with Rel?" She said, "I'm squaring with you first." He almost smiled. It was brief enough that she might have imagined it. He took her to Rel. Rel listened to the route analysis with the expression of a man who has calculated that he is being challenged and is deciding how to process that. He was professional about it. He asked 2 questions. He said the original route had been assessed by the planning cell. She said, "Yes, sir." She understood that. She just wanted to flag the channelization. He said he'd take another look at the imagery. The final route incorporated the western ridgeline approach. Nobody noted in writing whose idea it had been. Falcon Bridge launched at 011 feet. The weather was cold the way high-altitude Afghan nights are cold, not dramatically, just insistently, working its way through every layer until it lived inside the joints. She moved third in the file, carrying her rifle and a secondary load that included breach materials she'd been asked to manage, because the team was running lean on specialties. She didn't comment on the weight. Neither did anyone else. The approach took 51 minutes, longer than the original route would have taken. She ran the numbers in her head and said nothing. At the compound wall, Blaine signaled the breach. 2 operators moved to the primary gate. She took position on the southwest corner, with an operator named Diaz to cover the outer perimeter. What happened next took 11 seconds by her count and approximately 3 years to fully understand. The breach went loud. That was expected. The gate was reinforced. What was not expected was the secondary element that emerged from a structure 30 meters to the north. It had not been in the surveillance photos. It was 3 personnel, armed, moving with purpose toward the breach point, where Rel and 2 others were managing the gate. She processed it in the time it takes to process it. The first shot at 210 meters, the second at 216. The third, and this was the one she thought about later, in the way that you think about the shot that required the most of you. At 231, at a target that had already begun to move behind cover and that she'd tracked on a lateral angle that the ballistic math in her head had to solve faster than she could consciously solve it. 3 rounds, 3 effective. The breach team continued uninterrupted. The compound cleared in 4 minutes. All 3 high-value personnel were inside. The objective was achieved. On the exfil, Rel said nothing to her. Blaine walked beside her for approximately 40 meters and didn't say anything either. She thought that might be the end of it. Another thing that happened, documented, filed. Then Diaz said, quietly to no one in particular, "I've never seen that 3rd shot." She didn't respond, but she heard it and she understood what it meant. Coming from Diaz, who had 12 years in and was not generous with his assessments. The debrief was at 0600. Rel ran it. He was thorough and professional. He walked the team through every phase. When he got to the compound approach, he referenced the route modification and the rationale. He didn't say whose idea it had been. When he got to the perimeter action, he described the engagement and the outcome. He said the targeting had been effective and timely. Staff Sergeant Harlow, effective and timely. She filed it. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ashby, attended the tail end of the debrief. He had the bearing of a man who had attended hundreds of debriefs and was still paying attention to this one. He asked 3 questions. The third was directed at Blaine, who called the perimeter threat. Blaine said, "Harlow, no call. She was already on it before I got the radio." Ashby looked at her. He had the particular quality of attention that very good officers develop, which is not warmth exactly, but a kind of focused interest that feels like its own form of respect. He said, "Staff Sergeant." She said, "Sir." He said, "Good work," 2 words. She carried them for a long time. The weeks after Falcon Bridge were different in ways that were mostly small and occasionally significant. Rel started making eye contact. It wasn't an apology. He wasn't that kind of man, and she didn't need him to be. It was just an adjustment, the way a machine makes an adjustment when it encounters a load it hadn't been configured for. Dia started sitting near her at meals. He didn't say much, neither did she. But there was a comfort in his proximity that she recognized from earlier deployments, when proximity from someone credible was its own form of communication. The shift in the team room was harder to name. She'd walk in and the conversation wouldn't stop. That was it. The conversations just continued. Odom started bringing her into discussions she hadn't been part of before. Questions about site exploitation, about route assessment, about the kind of applied problem solving that she'd been doing quietly in her own head for months. She contributed. They argued sometimes in the direct, professional way that good teams argue. She was occasionally wrong. So were they. Nobody kept score. She thought about her father a lot during that period. About the way he'd never talked about what was hard. About how she'd inherited that, and about whether it had served her. She decided it had, mostly. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was density. It was the weight of everything she'd processed and kept moving through. That was something she'd learned from him, even if he'd never meant to teach it. She didn't call home much. When she did, her daughter, she'd had a daughter at 24, brief marriage, long story, would tell her about school and about the neighbor's dog and about a fight with a friend that was already resolving by the time Harlow heard about it. She'd listen. She'd ask questions. She'd say, "I love you," in the particular way that people who aren't used to saying it say it, which is quickly and only once, because saying it twice makes it feel like you're explaining it. Her daughter always said it back. That was enough. The operation that ended the deployment was called Ridgeline Hold. It wasn't in the original mission set. It was the kind of task that generates itself when the situation on the ground develops faster than the planning cycle, which in Kunar province was something that happened regularly enough that the battalion had stopped being surprised by it. A coalition element had been isolated on a ridge system 6 kilometers east. Their exfil route was compromised. They had 2 wounded. The QRF was grounded by weather. Someone needed to go get them. Falcon Bridge had already been stood down. The team was packed out 12 hours from rotation home. Ashby called Blaine. Blaine called Rel. Rel looked at his team, who had been awake for 19 hours and were carrying luggage instead of kit, and said, "How fast can we repack?" 40 minutes later, they were moving. The plan was simple because the situation didn't allow for complexity. Reach the ridge, secure the isolated element, find a viable exfil. Simple plans are not easy plans. They are just plans without extra parts. The route took them through 2 kilometers of exposed terrain and deteriorating visibility. The weather that had grounded the QRF was moving in from the northwest, which in practical terms meant wind, which in practical terms meant that every calculation involving distance and ballistics needed to be reworked in real time. Harlow ran the numbers as they moved, not out loud, just in her head, updating. The ridge was steep. By the time they were 300 meters from the isolated element's position, the weather had gone from deteriorating to fully degraded. Visibility was approximately 200 meters. The isolated element was holding a small saddle feature. Harlow could hear the firefight before she could see it. What she understood immediately, moving to a position of advantage on the left flank, was that the threat geometry had changed from what the initial report had described. The element was not being pressed from the north. They were being pressed from 3 sides, with the heaviest concentration on the eastern approach, which was the side Falcon Bridge was coming from. She called it clear, fast, specific, threat-bearing, estimated count, recommended fire distribution. Rel adjusted without discussion. The team split correctly. What happened over the next 22 minutes was never going to make it into any official account that read like a story, because the official account would concern itself with facts and sequences and outcomes, and what actually happened had the texture of something much harder to document. It was the experience of doing what you were trained to do, under conditions designed to make that impossible, with people who had decided to trust you not because they had to, but because the situation had removed every other option. She fired 31 times. She tracked 7 engagements across 270 meters of degraded visibility terrain in 40 km/h wind. She made adjustments she would not have been able to explain in technical language until she sat down 2 days later and worked backward from the results. Every round was accountable. The isolated element was extracted. Both wounded survived. The team exfilled under covering fire and got off the ridge before the weather closed entirely. On the helicopter, she sat against the frame and looked at nothing. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when it mattered. Afterward was when the steadiness went away and she'd learned to wait it out. She looked at her hands and waited. Diaz was across from her. He met her eyes and nodded once. She nodded back. That was enough. The awards process was what it was. Paperwork went up. Paperwork came back down, modified. That was standard. What was not standard, or perhaps was too standard, in the wrong direction, was that the initial recommendation came back with the citation rewritten in language so carefully softened that the action it described was no longer quite recognizable as the action that had occurred. Blaine noticed. Ashby noticed most of all. What Ashby did with that noticing was unusual. He went 2 levels up. He put his name on a supplemental memo that described, in the direct and unambiguous language of a man who had been there and who intended to be on record, exactly what Staff Sergeant Harlow had done on Ridgeline Hold, and why the original language was insufficient to the facts. She didn't know about the memo until it was done. He didn't ask her permission. He didn't tell her he was doing it. He just did it, because it was the right thing to do, and he was in a position to do it, and in his understanding of the job, that was sufficient reason. The award came through as submitted. There was no ceremony during the deployment. She got the paperwork in an envelope from the admin sergeant, and she put it in her bag and she packed out the next morning. On the flight home, somewhere over the Atlantic, she took the paperwork out and read it. The language was her actions rendered in official terms, and it was accurate, and something about reading accurate things about yourself is harder than you expect, when most of what you've read has been approximate. She read it twice. She put it away. She slept for the first time in 3 days. The homecoming was at Fort Lewis. Families on the tarmac. The kind of cold Pacific Northwest morning that is not cold enough to be dramatic, but that gets into your bones if you stand still too long. Her daughter was there. She was 11 now, the same age Harlow had been when her mother died, and she was standing at the edge of the crowd with the particular expression of a child who has rehearsed staying calm and is not entirely succeeding. She was holding a sign. It said Staff Sergeant Mom in red marker, and the letters were very large, and one of them was backward. Harlow saw it from 50 meters away. She didn't quicken her pace. She wasn't the kind of person who quickened her pace. But something in her chest did something she'd learned to expect after long deployments, which is that the armor you build for the field is not wrong. It's just not designed for this, and you have to let it adjust. She reached her daughter. She put one hand on the top of her head, the way she'd done since she was small. Her daughter said, "You're finally home." She said, "Yeah, I'm home." Then her daughter showed her the sign more closely and said very seriously, "I wasn't sure how to spell sergeant." Harlow looked at it. She said, "You got most of it." Her daughter said, "Which part did I miss?" She said, "Just a couple letters." Her daughter considered this and said, "That's still passing." Harlow almost smiled. It was brief enough that she might have imagined it, but she didn't imagine it. And her daughter, who had been reading her face, since she was old enough to understand that her mother's silences meant things, saw it clearly. She saw it, and she put her arm through her mother's, and they walked toward the parking lot together, and the morning was cold, and the sign was slightly misspelled, and everything was exactly as it should be.